The signal in the noise. May 14, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning air hung thick with salt and humidity as the first rays of sunlight bled through the open louvers of Building 1 at Station HYPO. Inside, the low hum of machinery and the sharp clatter of typewriter keys broke the silence. Cigarette smoke curled lazily above rows of desks buried under paper. Intercepted Japanese messages printed in tight, coded streams of numbers. To the untrained eye, it was nonsense. To the men and women of HYPO, it was the language of war. In the middle of this controlled chaos stood a man in a rumpled Navy uniform, his tie loosened, his cap forgotten somewhere on the floor. Commander Joseph Rochefort, civilian by spirit, sailor by necessity, rubbed his tired eyes behind wireframe glasses. He hadn't slept in 20 hours. Around him, analysts murmured over code sheets, parsing out patterns, hunting meaning in madness. Every digit mattered. Every repeated sequence could be the difference between victory and disaster. Rochefort leaned over a table littered with message intercepts, muttering under his breath. JN 25, he said, the Japanese naval code. A cipher so dense it might as well have been written in fog. But HYPO had been chiseling at it for months. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, Rochefort's small, overworked team had begun to see the faint outline of something monstrous, a plan forming in Imperial Japanese Navy's encrypted chatter. One of his analysts, a young lieutenant named Joseph Finnegan, slid a slip of paper toward him. Commander, look at this, repeated reference to AF. Same indicators as before. Rochefort frowned. AF. The Japanese kept mentioning it. In code groups that hinted at a target. A place. But where? He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest. If they could identify AF, they might learn Japan's next move. But if they were wrong, if they misread the signs, the next Pearl Harbor could be just weeks away. A teletype machine stuttered to life in the corner, spitting out a new intercept from the listening station at Midway. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Rochefort glanced at the clock, 0932 hours, and made a note in his log. The Japanese fleet was moving, but where and when? He straightened up, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. All right, he said to the room. Let's get to work. Find me AF. The team nodded. There was no salute, no formal acknowledgement. Only the renewed scratch of pencils and the soft rustle of code sheets. Outside, the Pacific shimmered under the tropical sun. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Japan's carriers were already preparing to strike again. What Rochefort didn't know, not yet, was that in less than 3 weeks, his cryptologic gamble would decide the fate of the Pacific. The trap hidden in plain sight. May 22nd, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Oahu. The fan blades above Joseph Rochefort's desk turned lazily, doing little to cut through the thick Hawaiian heat. A dozen typewriters clattered in syncopated rhythm, the air heavy with caffeine and code. Around the room, the men and women of Station HYPO were fighting a different kind of war. One wage in numbers, repetition, and silence. Commander, Finnegan called out from across the room. Another intercept from Tokyo to the fleet. AF is still mentioned. Repeatedly. Rochefort leaned over the message. The code groups were still partly indecipherable. Jan. 25 remained only partially broken. But HYPO's analysts had a gift for reading between the lines. The Japanese were planning a major operation, something on a scale they hadn't attempted since Pearl Harbor. The only clue, AF. He turned to the map on the wall. The Pacific stretched before him in shades of blue and red pencil marks. Each red pinned a potential target. They want AF, he muttered, tracing a finger across the Central Pacific. But is it Midway or something further south? The Navy in Washington wasn't convinced. In a secure teleconference with OP-20G, the Navy's cryptologic headquarters, Rochefort made his case. All indicators suggest AF is Midway. The Japanese are preparing to strike there within weeks. A pause crackled over the line. Then a voice, cold, bureaucratic, skeptical. Commander Rochefort, that's an assumption, not proof. He clenched his jaw. Proof, he echoed. All right, we'll get you proof. That night, the plan was born. Rochefort and his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, worked with Midway's communications officer to stage a ruse. Midway would transmit an unencrypted message, something mundane, believable. Midway reports water distillation plant out of order. Need fresh water urgently. Hours later, HYPO intercepted a Japanese transmission. Within it, a code report. AF is short on water. Rochefort stared at the intercept, heart pounding. There it was. Proof. The Japanese themselves had confirmed it. AF was Midway. He walked the message across the room, holding it like a live grenade. Send it to Nimitz, he told Finnegan. Now. At Pearl Harbor headquarters, Admiral Nimitz, calm and unshakable as ever, read the decoded summary in silence. Rochefort's intelligence meant everything. If Japan was coming from Midway, the U.S. had a chance, a slim one, to turn the tables. He looked up at his operations staff. Give me Fletcher and Spruance. We're setting the trap. Back at HYPO, Rochefort exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. The pieces had aligned, but he knew the danger wasn't over. If his analysis was wrong, if the Japanese changed their code books, or if Washington doubted him again, the fleet would be sailing blind into the largest naval ambush of the war. Outside, the surf crashed gently against the Pearl Harbor docks. The same sound that had accompanied death 6 months earlier now whispered through the night, a reminder of what was at stake. Rochefort poured another cup of coffee and went back to his desk. The Japanese Navy had made its move. Now it was America's turn. The invisible battle begins. May 30th, 1942. Pacific Ocean, 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. The sea was calm, deceptively calm, under the waxing moon. Somewhere beneath that glittering horizon, two fleets were moving toward each other, blind to all but what their intelligence could see. In a small, unmarked room back at Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort sat hunched over a stack of intercepted signals, headphones pressed against his ears. Static hissed, followed by bursts of rapid Morse. Another Japanese transmission, tight and urgent. He scribbled notes across a yellow pad, call signs, bearings, movement reports, all flowing through the air like ghosts. HYPO's analysts recorded each fragment, their fingers blackened with carbon paper, their eyes red from fatigue. Commander, Finnegan said softly, sliding a slip across the table. We got confirmation of Car Div-1 moving north of Midway. Tone and Chikuma are in position for reconnaissance. Rochefort nodded. The Japanese were committing everything. For fleet carriers, the same that had struck Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. This was no feint. It was a decisive blow Yamamoto had promised his emperor. He turned toward the massive map dominating the wall, colored threads marking ship movements across thousands of miles of ocean. Red threads for Japan, blue for America. The lines were converging near one small Midway. He pressed his palms against the map table, whispering under his breath, "Come on, Nimitz. You've got what you need." On the deck of the USS Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance stood in the wind, his binoculars fixed on the endless expanse ahead. To his left, the Hornet steamed in formation, her deck bristling with dauntless dive bombers and torpedo planes. To the north, the Yorktown, hastily repaired after the Coral Sea battle, limp but ready. Spruance's orders were simple and terrifying: lie in wait. Rochefort's codebreakers had placed Japan's attack window between June 3rd and June 5th. If he was wrong, the U.S. Navy would be stranded, their carriers exposed, their chance lost. But if he was right, if Station HYPO's Invisible War had read Japan's playbook correctly, the hunter would become the hunted. June 3rd, 1942. Midway Atoll. The first Japanese scout planes appeared on the horizon just after dawn. Sirens wailed across the atoll, and Marines scrambled to their positions. Bombers roared overhead, dropping their payloads in violent bursts of fire and sand. At Pearl Harbor, Rochefort watched the reports flow into the radio net. Midway under attack, the message read, requesting immediate air support. He knew what it meant. The Japanese main body was near. The moment of truth had arrived. In that dim operations room, a small group of codebreakers sat surrounded by static, sweat, and anticipation. They were thousands of miles from the fight, But every explosion, every ship movement, every pilot's report passed through their hands first. Finnegan broke the silence. "They've taken the bait." Rochefort leaned back, exhausted, the faintest smile breaking through. "Then let's see how good our trap really is." Outside, the Hawaiian sun burned through a clear morning sky, the calm before the storm that would decide the Pacific, the day of the decisive battle. June 4th, 1942. Dawn over the Pacific. The sea was an endless sheet of glass, broken only by the wakes of 3 American carriers holding formation north of Midway. The horizon glowed faintly orange as the first carrier decks came alive, engines whining, deck crews shouting, fuel hoses snaking between bombers. On the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, air crews ran final checks on their dauntless dive bombers and Devastator torpedo planes. Sweat and adrenaline mingled in the humid air. Above it all, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge, quiet, calculating. He had read Rochefort's decoded briefings a dozen times. The Japanese would come from the northwest. They believed the American fleet was still at Pearl Harbor. They were wrong, dangerously wrong. Spruance turned to his air officer. "Launch the first strike. Let's catch them before they find us." The order raced through the ship. Moments later, one by one, aircraft thundered down the deck and vanished into the glowing horizon, bound for the coordinate Station HYPO had predicted. Back at Pearl Harbor, hundreds of miles away, Joseph Rochefort sat in a folding chair, headphones clamped over his ears, listening to the static-laced chatter of the Pacific. Every coded message, every carrier signal, passed through HYPO first. His analysts worked in tense silence, decrypting as fast as they could. Japanese carrier sighted, bearing 320, distance 180 miles. An operator relayed. Rochefort's pulse quickened. The numbers aligned perfectly with his forecasts. "That's it," he murmured. "We've got them." At 0920 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown broke through a layer of clouds. And there they were. For massive Japanese carriers steaming in formation, their decks loaded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed after their attack on Midway. The radio crackled. "There they are, boys. Let's hit 'em." From thousands of feet above, the U.S. bombers tipped forward, engines screaming, as they dove almost vertically through flak and tracer fire. Bombs fell, silver glints against blue, and then the sea erupted in fire. Akagi, Kaga, and Soria took direct hits. Within minutes, their decks were engulfed in towering flames. Black smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles. Japanese crews fought desperately to contain the infernos, but it was too late. Fuel lines exploded. Munitions cooked off. The pride of the Imperial Navy was burning. Rochefort received the first after-action reports within the hour. 3 enemy carriers hit, burning. He stared at the teletype printout for a long moment, emotion catching in his throat. Then he smiled faintly, exhaustion and relief colliding. "They never saw it coming," Finnegan whispered beside him. "No," Rochefort replied softly. "But we did." As the day wore on, the final Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched a desperate counterattack, crippling the Yorktown. But by afternoon, American planes found Hiryu and sent her to the depths as well. For Japanese carriers, gone. The balance of the Pacific had shifted in a single day. That night, while fires still raged on the ocean, the men of Station HYPO worked quietly, intercepting the panicked Japanese retreat signals. Rochefort didn't celebrate. He simply leaned back, eyes closed, as the last message came through. The enemy was withdrawing. The trap had worked. The unsung victory. June 6, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The war room was quiet now. For the first time in months, Station HYPO wasn't filled with the clatter of typewriters or the drone of teletype machines. Cigarette butts overflowed the ashtrays, cold coffee cups lined the tables, and the exhausted faces of Rochefort's team glowed faintly under the flicker of fluorescent lights. The battle reports were still coming in, but the outcome was clear. Japan's carrier force, the same one that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was gone. Commander Joseph Rochefort stood at the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the Pacific chart. The red pins that had once traced Japan's advance across the ocean now stood motionless. No longer a threat, but a memory. Lieutenant Finnegan stepped beside him. "Sir," he said, voice low, "word is, the Japanese lost all four of their carriers." Rochefort nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "For sunk," he said. "Maybe more. God, they never had a chance." He exhaled deeply, his breath trembling with exhaustion. For weeks, he'd lived in this windowless room, fighting an invisible war, one fought with pencils, code sheets, and intuition. And now, the proof of their victory lay thousands of miles away in burning oil slicks and drifting debris. Hours later, Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived. He entered HYPO quietly, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable. Every man and woman in the room rose as he walked toward Rochefort. Nimitz extended his hand. "Joe," he said simply, "you and your team just won the most important naval battle in American history." Rochefort shook his hand, but his response was modest, almost hesitant. "We just read their mail, Admiral. You and Spruance did the rest." Nimitz smiled faintly. Reading their mail was the hard part. It was true. Without HYPO's decrypts, without Rochefort's gamble that AF was Midway, and his daring deception confirm it, the U.S. fleet would have sailed blind into disaster. Instead, they'd turned the tide of the Pacific War. But in Washington, politics had its own logic. Within weeks, credit for the victory began to shift. Other intelligence officers downplayed HYPO's role, eager to claim their share of the triumph. Rochefort was quietly reassigned, first to a desk job in San Francisco, then to a shipyard, far from the war he had helped to win. He didn't complain. He packed his typewriter, his books on Japanese linguistics, and left without ceremony. Years later, when the truth finally came to light, historians would call Rochefort's work at Midway one of the greatest intelligence coups in military history. His cryptanalysts, the civilians and sailors who had labored in that hot, airless room in Pearl Harbor, had changed the course of the war not with guns or bombs, but with logic, patience, and nerve. June 7, 1942. Midway Atoll. The Pacific was still smoking. Oil fires burned on the horizon, and the sea was littered with wreckage. Fragments of steel, lifeboats, and the faint scent of cordite. A young U.S. signalman aboard the Enterprise looked out over the waves and whispered to himself, "We got him." Back in Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort stepped outside for the first time in days. The sun hit his face, warm and blinding. The same sun that had risen over Pearl Harbor on December 7th now shone on a different world, one in which the tide had finally turned. He adjusted his rumpled uniform, took a slow breath, and walked toward the mess hall. There was no parade, no music, no medals, just quiet satisfaction and the knowledge that for once, the codebreakers had been heard. The Pacific War would rage on for 3 more years. But because of one civilian cryptanalyst and his stubborn belief in the patterns hidden within chaos, America had won the battle that changed everything.